Now that we have our drums out of the way, we could start working on our synthesizer patches. While synthwave music features heavy use of melodic chord progressions and leads, which gives it kind of the overall flavor, the main driving element of the entire track that really holds everything together is the bass line. Now there are two main layers to this bass line, the first of which is going to be this very punchy low-pass bass, and then the second is going to be this arpeggiated kind of top layer that we'll cover in the next video. In other music, like trap music for example, the bass tends to be very long and the notes are very drawn out. In contrast, synthwave tracks have a very short repeating stab bass that's very inspired by analog synthesis and a lot of the stab basses that you'd create on things like the Roland Juno 60 synthesizer. So for this song, we're going to be using a selection of presets from one of the UVI workstation. It's going to be the JP Legacy library. And you could really use any synthesizer you want, just make sure you're using some sort of analog modeled synthesizer. But the reason we'll be using all the stuff from UVI is because it'll make the process a lot easier, and that way we can kind of focus on composition and the characteristics that we're going for with the different synth patches, then how to write all the different chord progressions and bass lines. So for this sound, we're looking for something that's a very short stab sound, and where the filter of the bass is closing quite quickly whenever a note is held. This closing of a filter, which in this case is going to be a low-pass filter with a very short decay envelope, is what creates that very 80s synthesized stab sound. So I went ahead and loaded up a copy of the UVI workstation, and we can double-click on our browser and go over to the JP Legacy library. And let's choose the Saturn 8 synthesizer, which emulates a Roland Jupiter 8 synth. You could also use any Juno 60 modeled synthesizer as well, but these synths are very similar, and the Juno 8 was basically the big brother to the Juno 60. So they sound relatively similar, so that's why we're using this synthesizer. So let's go over to the bass, because we're looking for a bass line. Let's go over to the Unison Star preset. And then we can just press OK and load that up. Basically, the way that this works is like an advanced sampler, almost kind of like Nexus. We have the ability to change filtering, amplitude envelopes, adjust oscillators, edit various different modulations, and there's even effects and stuff in here too. So it's a great starting point whenever you're making these more vintage styles like synthwave to get these vintage sounds without having to worry about a bunch of heavy sound design. So this bass patch just sounds like this. So it's very punchy, has a little bit of a high resonance. You can also hear there's some sort of low pass filter being closed. But most importantly for our purposes, this patch sounds good whenever it's repeated rather quickly. It's going to help give us this kind of driving, intense sound. So let's take this patch a step further. Let me go ahead and just swap over to the mixer here and just turn that down a little bit in volume. That way we don't have any clipping issues. Now let's take this sound a bit further and make it sound even more 80s. To do this, we're going to be loading in a chorus effect. Now the chorus that's inside of the UVI workstation sounds quite good, and you could always use that one, but I really enjoy the sound of the chorus unit from a Roland Juno 60 synthesizer. And since that's the type of patch they're wanting to kind of recreate, let's go ahead and add in an emulation of that effect. So for this, we're going to be loading in the Tall Chorus. There's the Tall Chorus LX. This is a really excellent free plugin from Tugwell Audio Line. But if you just look up this VST company, you can download this effect for totally free. You don't even have to sign up or anything, you can just download it. They've got VST, RTAS, and AU versions, I believe. And this models the chorus unit that was built into the Juno 60 synthesizer. And a lot of times free plugins tend not to really sound that great, but this one's definitely an exception. It sounds absolutely fantastic, especially if you make lots of vintage sounding tracks with lots of these chorusy synth basses or things like that. This is a really excellent plugin, and I use it all the time in my own productions. So swap that over to Chorus Mode 2, which is a more intense chorus. Basically, it has a higher depth control. Then bring the dry wet down just a little bit, and that sounds like this. So you can hear it adds in some phasing and pitch shifting and everything, which gives us a more 80s tone. And then also in this signal, you can hear that there's a very muddy low-mid frequency going on. Let's go ahead and just clean that up with some equalization. And you could load in any of your favorite equalizers here. One inside Ableton sounds really excellent. For this example, I'm just going to use the FabFilter Pro Q. And the only reason I'm doing that is because the interface is a bit bigger and it's a bit easier to see. And I can also solo out what I'm doing to show you what they sound like. So to just make it a bit easier for the sake of the demo. But the one in Ableton works just as great. We'll drop in the Pro Q2. Now let's go ahead and make two EQ adjustments. So let's first make a low mid cut here. I'll change this over to the 24 decibel filter so it's a bit steeper. As you can see, the edges of this cutoff here are a little bit steeper. That's purely an optional step. Let's go ahead and put that at 175. Let's take that gain control down to probably about 2 or 3. Could also bring the band Q down as well. To kind of just help widen everything up a bit. And that sounds like this. So basically just cutting out all this stuff. Could do that in an amount of -3, and that should give us the right amount of cut. Then I want to make a low shelf cut just to address some of the boominess and kind of this low area here. So let's go ahead and create a low shelf. Let's have that be at 169. And then let's bring the gain down just a few decibels here, probably about 2. So bring that down to an amount of 3. And that sounds like this. So it just tightens up our sound and addresses some of those low-end problems that we're hearing. And let's also add in some quick saturation as well. So we'll just use Ableton Live's built-in saturator. So we'll go over here and just search for the saturator. And the reason I'm doing this is just basically to give our whole sound more of a tape analog flavor, which gives you this nice distorted quality to it. And you could always use a tape plugin if you have one laying around, but for this example, I just want to show you how to do it with a saturator, just so you don't have to buy tons of additional plugins to follow along. So we could do a drive amount of 2, then we can go ahead and take the output gain down -2. That way it kind of volume matches everything. That sounds like this. That's a pretty subtle effect, but it just adds a little bit of grit and a little bit of distortion. Then we want to compress this a little bit, and we'll use the glue compressor. This will help make everything smack a little bit more. And the glue compressor here models a SSL bus compressor. SSL mixing consoles and SSL compressors became quite popular during the 80s. This is definitely a sound that's going to fit with the overall kind of characteristic that we're going for. And it also just sounds really great as well. So we'll go ahead and boost that attack up to an amount of 3. So it's a bit punchier. Take the release all the way down so it jumps up pretty quick. And then we'll take the threshold down to -10.2. And then we'll take the makeup gain just under 5 decibels. That sounds like this. And then we'll also turn on that soft clip as well so we don't have any clipping issues. So this just makes the bass a little bit more aggressive and a little bit more punchy. So now with that sound design out of the way, we can go ahead and move on to creating our melody. So first we have to choose a key to work in for our track. In synthwave music, minor scales tend to work the best for evoking this kind of 80s nostalgic flavor. I find that A minor, and remember that minor scales are great for this type of thing, sounds nice and nostalgic sounding, which is what we're going for, and it's also pretty simple to write in as well, so it'll be great for the sake of an example. So that includes the notes A as the root, B, C, D, E, F, and G. This scale is the minor equivalent to the C major scale, but instead of going back to the note C whenever our melodic parts finish, it's going to want to keep going back to the note A, which is what gives it its more dark minor flavor. So let's create a 4-bar clip here. I'll just do Command-Shift-M to create a 4-bar clip. Make sure the snap is set to 16th notes. You can zoom in here because we're zoomed out quite far. And then what I want to do is start off on our root note, which is going to be A. And let's go down to the 2nd octave and go to A2. So I'll just solo this out real quick. And that sounds like this. So it's a nice short stab note. Let's go ahead and just put 16th notes on every step of this 4-bar sequence. Then we'll be adjusting the melodic placement of those notes a little bit later. So we can just copy over everything real quick. So we have all these different notes. That gives us a very punchy sound, and it also kind of sounds like it's rolling along. Just like how the kick and snare pattern that we created in the previous videos has this kind of march to it. So what we'll do is for this first bar, we'll keep everything playing that A note. For the next 3 quarter notes, we'll have all these different A notes. And then for that last section here of the last section of the 2nd bar, I want to have this jump up to the 3rd step in the scale. So remember that this scale is all these different white keys on the keyboard. So this is step 1, A, B would be step 2, and C would be step 3. So we'll go up to step number 3. And the reason we're doing that is because that's a pretty common chord interval here. A 1-3-5 chord, for example, is a triad chord, which is quite commonly used in music. So far that kind of sounds like this. So now it starts to sound like it's going somewhere. The C note kind of transitions you into the next section, and then the listener sort of expects a change to happen. So let's go ahead and select all those notes, and then we're going to drop this down to an F note. And that's F2 in the second octave. And this will sound nice and interesting because it's going to be the 6th note in the scale. So if this is the first note, this is the second note, third, fourth, fifth, and 6th, the 6th note is F. Now this is going to give us some tension because it's sort of an unusual interval. Normally you would go up to the 7th, which would be a perfect 7th, which is G, which would sound nice and melodically resolved, but in this case it's going to add some tension because we went to the 6th. And from there it really sounds like it's going to go somewhere. There's not this melodic resolution that you get with this A note. So on the last section of that bar, those last 4 16th notes, let's have it jump up to the 7th, which in this case is going to be G. So if you were to count up to the next G here, that would be up 7 steps in that scale. And that sounds like this. And then from there, the whole sequence wants to go back to that A note so that you get that resolution. But then the sequence just kind of endlessly repeats from there. This type of sequence is really interesting because it feels like it's looping back on itself and that it never fully resolves. This type of thing is very common in synthwave music because it has that sort of driving, hypnotic feel to it. And it's also very inspired by old school video game music, where the music would need to be these very short looping patterns. Because of the memory limitations that the game systems had, you have these very short looping melodic sequences that would create these almost endless patterns. Let me go ahead and just loop that bass, and I'll show you what this sounds like. You can hear it always just kind of feels like it's looping endlessly. So because of how we've placed these different notes, it creates a sequence that never feels fully resolved, even when it comes back to the root note. And that's what you want to do for the synthwave tracks. For example, if I just played through the note sequence here, the last note that you'd expect would be this A, because it's the final note and the root note in that scale. And that finally gives you that kind of resolution that you're looking for. But if I played a melodic sequence like this, you really want it to go somewhere. You can't really end that sequence there because it'll feel very kind of stressful for the listener. So you want to go back to this A note. And that finally gives you that resolution that you're looking for. So by leveraging this musical effect, you can create these sort of endless sequences with the music that always feels like it's going somewhere, and it keeps things feeling fresh for the listener. So synthwave is all about using this musical tension to your advantage to create these very exciting musical patterns. So let's go ahead and just make a little bit of a volume change. And then we can also copy this over as well. And then in context of what we have so far in the track, everything sounds like this. So this type of bass is also sometimes sidechained to the kick drum as well, but I found for this track it actually sounded better in the final mix when I didn't sidechain the kick, but you'll just want to be aware that that's something that you could do in synthwave tracks if you need to for your mix down. So now that we have this strong driving melodic foundation for the rest of our song, from here we can add in this arpeggiated mid layer to add in some different melodic accents to the bass line and to help kind of push things along.